my company, Town Associates, we'd acquired the book Siege of Trenches Farm, and what I loved about it was the premise and the last sequence, the idea of people without martial arts skills defending their home and turf against the hooligans. And I had worked with Sam Peckinpah before on some television specials that I had done, and asked him if he would. I called and I said, "Would you like to direct this, adapt and direct it?" He wasn't available for adaptation; he was doing something. But I said, "Would you like to direct it?" And he said, "I'd love to, but I should tell you that I'm blacklisted. You may not want to use me." And I said, "It's all the more reason I do want to use you." And I had asked David Z. Goodman, who I had worked with before, to do the adaptation, and then he and Sam did the final shooting polish together, with a big contribution from Dustin. It kind of, I guess it took a while for me to get it set up, because the sine qua non was getting a known actor, and Dustin had only done 1 or 2 pictures before then. The first picture was The Graduate, which made him an overnight star, and it took me a long time. Sam and I met with him in New York, where I was living at the time. Then Sam had to go back to California, and I had countless meetings with Dustin, because he's very careful about what he does. And finally he was persuaded, and we just set off, did a long prep in England, during which time we went crazy finding the right locations. As a matter of fact, Sam and I divided the UK, and I went to one part of the country and he went to the other. Actually, he went as far as Scotland, and he found a location there that he loved, and I flew down to it, but it wasn't practical. And I, meanwhile, came across St. Ives, which I thought was this marvelous small English fishing village, and quaint beyond the word quaint, until I wandered in it the first day, turned a corner, and there was Hepworth sculpture. It turned out there were major international known artists who were living there. But anyway, we scouted it. Sam came down, we found the specific locations, and then actually shot in a little village outside St. Ives called St. Buryan's, which consisted of 1 street and a few pubs. And that was it. We never had a title we liked. We know we didn't like Siege of Trenches Farm, because nobody knew what Trenches Farm meant or was. And as any time you have to change a title or find a title, it's always horrendous. And finally, I organized a contest among the cast and the crew and anybody who, the waiters in the hotel, saying anybody who can come up with a title, we had some kind of prize for. And actually it was one of the crew, one of Sam's old friends, who came up with the title, which is a quote from Lao Tse, and it has no particular meaning, but it just sounded, it's so ambiguous that you can only read anything into it. And it also gave us a real key for the artwork and everything else. And so it's hard to remember that a picture was ever called anything but Straw Dogs. The idea, it was at a time where the dilemma of the lead character, played by Dustin Hoffman, of David, confronting the violence in America after Martin Luther King's assassination and Bobby Kennedy's. It was a time when we all felt so strongly about violence, and it was the opportunity to, while providing excitement and entertainment, to make a statement about, be able to make an anti-violence vehicle was particularly interesting to all of us, particularly to me. It was always a problem in Sam's later years, even when I'd worked with him earlier, and he always vowed that he was stopped drinking and he was only drinking wine and he was not going to drink anything by the shoot. And he did go on shooting, and at one point I remember drinking rather during the shooting, and I remember one point saying to him I would have to replace him if he kept on drinking, and he said, "You wouldn't do that, you're my friend." And I said, "It's because I'm my friend, your friend, I would do it." And at one point, he got sick, not from drinking. He got some kind of upper respiratory infection, and we had to put him in the hospital for a couple of days. So there was a rumor that that we had to be hospitalized because of drinking, but he had some form of walking pneumonia. But he always had a thermos of coffee, next to him as he was shooting. And every time I walked by, he would offer me coffee and make me have a drink with him, because I knew that as soon as I walked away, there was a switched thermos, and there was a little brandy probably in his coffee, but we didn't lose any time because of it. There was some agitation, probably, as I would think as I reconstructed, from the distributor and the insurance company, the film bonding company, because once he was sick, nobody knew how long it would take to get better. So there was an agitation, and Peter Yates' name came up because he was a terribly talented guy whose work we all knew. Actually, there was one other thing that I did, which was I'm not proud of, was somewhat manipulative. As we lost a couple of days, there was a director in London who was not a terribly admired man, but somebody that the film bonding company would use if they ever had to take over a picture. And at one point, as we lost a couple of days, and I knew I had to fend off the authorities, the people putting up the money, I hired an actor who's not recognizable to come down and stand on the set. And Sam a couple of times said, "Who's that fellow?" And don't worry about it. And by the third time when he said, "Sam," at the end of the day I said to him, "I guess I have to tell you, there's a real worry about our going over, and this is a director that they'll hire to replace us." And suddenly we picked up speed. He discussed things only generally, and then waited to see on film what he wanted. And within the parameters of his intelligence, that's where I felt he did provoke a performance. And there was not a lot of intellectualization, but Sam didn't do that with actors, although we indulged ourselves more. But I think Sam was always a little bit embarrassed at how intelligent he was. He was really quite intelligent, and very well educated. But I think the myth of Sam is the last man with guts and integrity in the film business, and the last man with the pure American Western ethic, was something that he kind of got caught up in. Actually, he came from a long family of judges, and is very, very well educated. Dustin Hoffman is an enormously creative and internal actor, and the contributions were, all through the film, less in the actual writing than in moments of dynamic playing, and also very often there was the moments in dialogue that any good actor makes his own. He has to state it in his own vernacular. And Dustin was particularly creative and inventive. We had difficulty working with Dustin. Had difficulty working with Sam because Dustin is one of the great internal, so-called method actors, and everything must have a rationale, and there must be real reason for every piece of behavior. And Sam works very intuitively and is less articulate, and I always felt that Sam, as his directing technique, rather than verbally eliciting a performance, would provoke a performance. And so it took Dustin a while to get used to that way of working, because he was used to discussing everything at length. But finally, everybody found a way to accommodate each other. Actually, the only choice. He was so right for it that I frankly don't know where I would have gone as an alternative. Perhaps Al Pacino, because of a quality of honesty and his size, frankly. But Dustin was somebody who I had admired so and was so anxious to work with that he was the only real choice. What had happened, and I don't know that it was ever planned, because we shot in continuity, the film was shot as the story unfolded, really, and that's not very usual. But in the very beginning, Dustin and Susan George bonded very, very well. They really liked each other very, very much. And as the film went on, and I don't know that it was conscious, I don't know that Sam provoked it, but I know that as their relationship as husband and wife deteriorated in the story, Dustin started relating to Susan George, and Sam started relating to her as the husband was relating to the wife. And at one point, I just thought it was so mean that I remember going and seeing Sam, taking him aside and saying, "You can't do this. This is inhuman." And I think, in his most poetic sense, he told me to piss off. He's getting the performance he wants. But I felt very badly that Susan, I think, was victimized by it, although I think it probably contributed to her wonderful performance. The chief censor was a lovely gentleman named Sir John Trevelyan, I believe. And when we had gotten a print close to our release print, I remember going back and standing over the moviola, the film equipment, with Sir John and a man named, I think, Stephen Murphy, who was an associate of his, running the rape scene, those few moments of one sequence, to convince him that what we were looking at, what he was looking at and worried about in the rape scene, was rear entry and not sodomy. One is acceptable, sodomy is not. And so that was a very ludicrous scene. And finally, we did get released initially in London and caused enormous controversy. And then I think the film was pulled after that. And I think this is probably going to be the first time it's available to the broad, to the country outside of London. I think anything of worth has to be constantly reevaluated. And the fact that this had been denied its audience for so long makes it even more timely. I'm very, very glad it's happening in the UK. You ask if I envisioned the film when I went to work on it as it ended. In general sense, sure, not the specific moments you can never envision, but the impact and the sequence and the basic story was what I'd hoped it to be. And really working with David Z. Goodman, we kind of forced that to be the story. And then when Sam came aboard, he and David worked on the actual dialogue polish and all of that. So it was very much what I hoped it to be and exceeded my wildest expectation. I was and am very proud of it. People have commented and asked about Sam's violence and have accused it of being almost pornographic. I would disagree, and I would probably say that pornography is in the eye of the beholder. I think to the degree that it's so powerful, so viscerally affecting, people have made that comment, but I think it's balderdash. Whatever balderdash is. I think it's nonsense. The one thing, other than the title, that hadn't been resolved before we actually started shooting were the very last moments in the film. And it was, in retrospect, quite wonderful and stimulating, because whenever there was any downtime, Sam and I, and then Sam, Dustin and I, and Sam and David Goodman, the writer, and I would discuss alternative endings, not changing the substance at all, really the very last moment. And actually, it came, I'd love to say that we all had a creative flash, but it was actually while Sam was shooting the last moments of the film, where Dustin Hoffman drives off with Susan George and David Warner in the car, and David Warner said, and it was to be originally the last line in the film, "I don't know my way home," and Dustin ad-libbed, "Neither do I." And the moment we all heard it, we knew that we had a powerful last beat. But that was there was no substantial, no substantive deviation from what we'd always conceived. The people have said because David Warner played with a decided limp, and people have read into it some great symbolism, then compounded by the fact that T.P. McKenna, who played the town authority figure, played his arm in a sling. Well, David Warner had broken his leg shortly before we hired him, and so we knew about his limp, and Sam and I had given a kind of party for the cast and crew just before I think we left the location, after we were rehearsing, and T.P., while performing a song on top of a table, fell off and broke his arm. And so he played that in a sling. Again, great symbolism. Every shoot is difficult and every shoot is wonderful. I don't remember it being any more difficult. It was the first film that I had ever produced. I'd been producing in television before then. So it was a great learning experience for me. And working with Sam, I had picked up a lot of insight about editing, and I had studied that at NYU before. But it wasn't particularly difficult other than the time constraints. I think the whole budget was no more than $2.4 million. I don't remember how many days it covered, but it's never enough. And schedules always expand to fill whatever is available anyway. And so there were a couple of days when I was jumping a little bit ahead of the shooting unit. I remember once, in one location, working with a pitchfork to clear the manure out of our next pigsty location and cow pen location. But it wasn't particularly difficult, except we were all living in this railroad hotel, and it was very cold and dank. And I think there were about 3 electric fires in the hotel, which we all huddled around at night. But other than that, it was a very exciting shoot for me. The other thing which was strange to me is at the lunch break every day when we were on location in St. Burrians, to watch the crew go into one of the 3 pubs and stand and drink their lunch. I was always astonished because I couldn't figure out how they would ever work after lunch, but it seems to be an inverse ratio to what is consumed. Do they work effectively? And even the actors can, consume enormous quantities of beer and ale and not be affected. I think if Dustin or I or Sam drank that much, we would not be ambulatory. Well, I think the reason, people have asked why it is still so powerful, and I think it is because its intensity is so honest, and it's so easy to identify with the principal actor, with Dustin's character, because when you first see him, and you see him reacting, come to this little village because of the violence in America, the death of Martin King and the death of Robert Kennedy, you feel when you first see him interacting with the town locals, the bullies in the town, that he may be a coward. Or first you think really that he's a pacifist. And then as he continues to be provoked, you feel, well, maybe he's a coward. And then by the end of the picture, you realize that what he fears the most is the violence within himself. And to the degree that all of us, when sufficiently provoked, or most of us have the ability to be violent, and the fear of doing real violence is part of why I think it is viscerally, emotionally so powerful. Plus the fact that Sam is so brilliant as a director, and as so many of the things that he invented in shooting violence have become cliches. At the time, I'd never seen violence in slow motion, particularly when he was shattering glass, etc., shattering windows. Well, by now it is such a cliche that it's lost so much of its power, but he set the tone in this picture and in The Wild Bunch, another one of his great films, for techniques that have been copied by so many good directors. It's interesting and flattering when you ask how I would like people to react to it and leave the theater. It hasn't changed at all. I think violence has gotten to be even more of a problem in the world than it was when we made the picture, and it was horrendously a problem then. And so it's just I would just like people to have the same feelings as we all have had about it, that it's, it's a condemnation of violence, an indication that it really doesn't resolve any conflict, it only causes more conflict. And I've always been opposed to rape.